Hi, Josh.
Hello.
Thanks so much for coming on. So, could you maybe just start by saying a bit about who you are, the work that you've done in the past, and then what you've been thinking about the most lately?
So, who I am is a deep philosophical question. But one thing that characterizes me, that people who know me know about me, is that I like to try to dig to an understanding, to get clear, to get more clear than I've been about things that are more fundamental. So, in my published work as a philosopher, people know that my work about the nature of fundamental reality. I've been thinking a lot about the nature of consciousness. Is consciousness fundamental? And if not, what is fundamental? How does consciousness exist? There's also an aspect of my interest that leads into what I would call life design, which is trying to understand like how to build a life, how to organize your resources, how to organize your time, how to connect with people, and to understand principles at a fundamental level. And I mentioned that here. This is not something I usually talk about, but I mentioned that here just because it's the same interest in trying to understand things at a fundamental level that applies to all the sections of life. It's not just about my life, but like anybody who's interested in the journey of philosophy um, can see that actually the tools that you use to understand things is very practical, is very relevant. And a lot of times I think people make a distinction in their mind between speculating about these things that nobody can get answers to versus real life, and I don't see that divide. That's not how it is for me. I see that everybody is curious about things and that there are tools for getting more and more clarity about the things that we're curious about. And well, I just happen to be curious about some of these philosophical topics, the nature of existence, but it's the same tools that lead me into those topics that I can use in other areas of life. So I would say that does characterize a lot about who I am. I teach at Baylor University. I have a PhD from the University of Notre Dame. And of course, I am a person just like you.
Thank you. Yep, that's very clear. Yeah, I really appreciate, especially your willingness to, well, not willingness, your emphasis on the relevance of the same kinds of modes of thinking or the same kinds of principles of reasoning to areas of life that might be sort of more obviously practical.
Yeah, right. And I mean, one example that's very basic is just the aim for truth. This might sound so simple in a way, but it's actually very powerful. You're more likely to get to something that you're actually aiming for, and you can aim consciously for that. Sometimes I talk about this example of when my family wanted to climb up a mountain. There's a certain mountain that we could see from our house, and we never been on top of that mountain. We could just see it. Well, one day we formed the intention to get on top of that mountain, and suddenly it became more likely that we would get on top of that mountain someday, which we did. But that intention was prior to getting to the top of the mountain. And so a lot of times when it comes to trying to understand something like in a relationship or in kind of how to use resources, it starts with the courage to actually aim to get information about that, to actually aim to get to the truth rather than having just more like protecting one's existing beliefs. And so this, I think, shows up in practical life and in philosophy because it takes a certain kind of courage to get to more truths about reality than you have right now. It's such a powerful tool. I mean, this is actually the basic tool from which all my other tools for developing a worldview and developing a life can be derived. Is the aim to get insights, the aim that, and that's a power we have control over. We don't have control over whether the experts got it right, because if we're trying to find something out and the experts disagree or they're trying to tell us what to believe, well, we can't control that directly, but we can control the aim to get to the truth. So then that aim can then lead to, all right, let me go test this expert, or let me investigate this other expert. Let me see if I can see it for myself. So it sounds simple, but actually, I think this is a basic power that makes such a huge difference, and this is a guiding light for me in my work. So as we talk about this kind of bridge of reason and thinking about the fundamental nature of reality, I'm going to use the tool even in my conversation with you because I don't want to rest on prior beliefs or prior understandings. With you, I'm going to explore it again with an aim for greater understanding, an aim for clarity. I'll share what I have, what I've thought about, but I want it to be, it's always like for me, it's a fresh conversation. It kind of gets to the edge of my thinking. Does that make sense? I'm aiming to get clear on this. That's the goal. And I find that goal really makes the difference. It also makes the difference between whether you're static in your understanding and whether you're dynamic.
Mm,
I think there are times when people play a role to kind of protect something, and there's value in that. But there's a different game you can play, which is the building of something. And evidence that you're playing that game is that your view is building. It's evolving. It doesn't just stay the same.
nice. Yeah, that makes sense. So with all that in mind, then, as the guiding light and the kind of purpose and aim of the discussion, we are going to be talking about what at least kind of popularly has been called the argument from limits, which you've done some work on in different places. So I was thinking maybe we could start by summarizing the dialectical context around that argument, as well as what its basic structure is, and then we can get into talking about some potential motivations.
That sounds great. And I want to share a little story. I've never shared this anywhere, ever in any place, which is when that argument first came into my mind. I was in graduate school and I was talking with some other grad students about the nature of fundamental reality. And we got to talking about arguments for God's existence. And the discussion brought my attention to different types of arguments, like an argument from design for a kind of intelligence behind the universe, an argument from cause and effect for kind of first cause, an argument from morality for like a supreme moral foundation, these different kinds of arguments. And I had just this sort of, I almost want to call it like a flash of insight that all those arguments are related in a core way, that all of them at some point appeal to some sort of ultimate explainer of the phenomenon to be explained, where that ultimate explainer is different in a relevant way from the phenomenon to be explained. And so I got to thinking about, oh, okay, well, what is that relevant way? And it occurred to me that, well, it seems like all of the bits of reality have certain kind of limits, boundaries, like the boundary of a mountain or the limit of somebody's ability to throw something. They all have these kind of limits and parameters. And if you explain the limits and parameters of knowledge, let's say, or intelligence, or complexity, or some kind of moral sense, you explain all of those, then the ultimate explanation has to be different in its nature to avoid circularity from what you're trying to explain. And then that leads to something whose nature has the quality to be explained, like it has some kind of awareness or knowledge, but it has it in an unlimited way. It has it in a purely complete way. And at that time, I used the language of a maximally great being. There's an argument here that unifies all those different dimensions of reality in terms of an ultimate explanation that carves away and shaves away the arbitrary limits and boundaries and parameters, so that we have a fundamental explanation that doesn't call for a further explanation in the same way as the things that are to be explained would call for further explanation, precisely because they have certain limits and boundaries. And you wonder, well, why does it have that limit? Why is it 10 trees rather than 11 trees that exist? Well, we can explain that in terms of something deeper. You could think of it as kind of a backbone of other arguments. It doesn't compete with those other arguments. And it's not really like a separate argument, like you've got the argument from consciousness and then you've got the argument from arbitrary limits. It's like the argument from arbitrary limits is sort of a backbone, or like goes into the argument from consciousness, because if you want to have a explanation of consciousness at the most fundamental level, then that explanation needs to be somehow different, again, different from the things that are to be explained.
Mm.
And I propose that one difference, important difference, has to do with those arbitrary limits and boundaries.
Okay. So it sounds like a big part of what you're thinking about is explaining things as far as you can, is explaining, in particular, in this case, limits, whether it be limits with respect to material or limits with respect to consciousness, even. So maybe we could talk a little bit about how you think considerations to do with explanation might motivate thinking that there is something which lacks limits and what implications that might have.
Yeah, that sounds good. So here I have a piece of reality with me, and this jar here, it It just has air in there. It's not like filled up with anything. Now you might wonder, could there be some red liquid that just appears in the jar in the next 4 seconds? Well, Robert, I'm going to make a prediction that no red liquid is going to appear in the next 4 seconds. And now I'm going to test this prediction. Now, this is a philosophical hypothesis about the nature of reality, that reality by its nature won't produce the red liquid in here. I mean, you could think of this as a scientific hypothesis as well. I don't really care how you classify it. Well, the 4 seconds has already elapsed, and we see that the red liquid hasn't appeared, right? Now, how was I
Yeah.
able to make that prediction? I mean, after all, never in the history of the world was there that particular time that I predicted. So, how was I able to make a prediction about this future event that it wouldn't get filled up with a red liquid? Well, here's one way of motivating this. It has to do with the principle of explanation, that in order for there to be some liquid in here, there's got to be some deeper explanation to, for example, cause it to come into here. And if that explanation is not available, I have empirical evidence that there's not explanation for getting the red liquid. If I had another cup with some red liquid, then I could pour it in, and then I could make a prediction. Hey, I'm going to pour it, and you could see it. But that's different because then there's an explanation available, right? So there's a principle of explanation, I think, that can explain. The principle of explanation itself can explain, or to use another term, predict our experience with things not just coming from nothing. Red liquid just appearing from nothing. And so that's a principle. You mentioned explain things as far as you can. Yeah. So if there's a way to explain this, then that's going to be more likely than just assuming that there's no explanation. The default assumption is there's going to be some explanation. I think this is part of ordinary experience. Now, the way this works with limits is that I mentioned a red liquid filling this jar. Well, this jar has a particular size, a particular weight and mass. It has particular limits. It's not like infinitely in its size. It's a particular size. And so if it has a particular size, then we can ask that question, well, why does it have that size rather than a different size? That's an explanatory question. Here's sort of the critical idea. The same principle of explanation that I can use, that I can appeal to make these predictions, that there's not going to be just random stuff coming in and out of existence. It's that same principle that also predicts an explanation of why it has this particular size and shape. Because that principle is explaining why things of arbitrary sizes and shapes don't just appear. And so this is a way of motivating a general principle. Now, let me just be clear. It doesn't yet follow that if it lacks any limits, that therefore it also lacks an explanation. That doesn't follow logically. The principle is more modest, which is that if it has limits, then it has a further explanation. And that comes from a more general principle that things that exist are going to have an explanation as far as they can, right? So unless you have some independent reason to think it can't have an explanation, then you have some reason from experience to think that it does have an explanation.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. I was thinking as you were saying that it sounds like part of what's going on is that you have a general principle, which is that all limits alike, have an explanation. And then from that principle, well, you can get different predictions. You can get the prediction that, for example, well, maybe, I don't know actually, how can you get that prediction? You can get, I guess, the prediction that you won't have any red liquid appearing in the cup in front of you.
Yeah, any kind of
Insofar as,
limited turtle or liquid or like limited reality won't just
yeah.
appear from nothing. Or you can take an existing reality and you could say, okay, so this has a certain size. Now imagine it doubling in size. Well, the
Mhm.
double in size is a particular limit.
Yeah.
And if that limit could just exist without any cause or explanation,
Yeah.
then, then I wouldn't be able to make this secure prediction that this isn't just going to
Mhm.
double in size without any
Mhm.
explanation.
Yeah. And so then there's at least one sense of explanation at play, which has to do with prediction. But is that the only sense you have at play, or are you thinking of it as well as being maybe sort of factive? So it's out there in the world. There are two
Mhm.
things, and one of them is really sort of explaining the other in some worldly sense. Or do you have different senses in mind, or is there some particular sense that you're trying to narrow in on?
Yeah, this is an important question because I don't actually want to build into my notion of explanation that is predictive. Rather, what I want to say is that um, if I have a principle of explanation, then I can make predictions. Not because it's part of my concept of explanation that is predictive. It's more of an implication, if that makes sense. So the way that I would like to think about explanation in this sort of ordinary way is that it somehow gives some answer to a why question in the most general sense of the word why. So I'm going to leave open different types of explanations. So you want to know, like, why does this microphone exist? I'm not asking about its purpose, like what's the purpose of the microphone. I'm asking about, like, why is there this microphone? Like, uh, maybe I could use a how question. How can there be this microphone, or how does this exist? Um, and then there could be an answer like, well, it was assembled, it was put together, and the prior conditions and causes add up to helping to answer that why question. And so that's why I think of it as an explanation, as a kind of answer to a why question. Another way I've thought about it, using more of an analogy, is that an explanation illuminates the thing to be explained. Well, how does it illuminate it? I mean, it doesn't like literally shed light, not literal light. It's just, the light in your mind of understanding, like, oh, there's actually a kind of feeling to it. It's like, oh, that helps me. Like, why is there this mess on the carpet? Oh, the kitten threw up. It's like, okay, that helped me understand where this came from. Right? But if instead it was like, no, there's just no answer to that question. It just appeared, right? Like there was no mess, and then there's a mess, and there's no answer. There's no illumination to satisfy that curiosity. Then there'd be no explanation.
Okay. And then when you're thinking, so it seems though that there's some kind of a working principle here that you're expecting some kind of an explanation, or that we should prefer having explanation. If we're thinking about it in terms of something like sort of an answer to a why question, how are you seeing the motivation for expecting a further explanation, expecting our kind of sense of uncertainty or questioning to be resolved?
It seems to me, as I've thought about this, that there are two types of motivations. One has to do with the experience. So there's a way of understanding your own experiences in terms of an explanatory order. For example, well, I mean, the example I use here, you can make a prediction that this won't fill up in the next 10 seconds, and and then you test that. It's like, oh, well, why did that prediction come true? Well, there might be many different principles to explain that, but a very general principle that explains this experience is a general principle of explanation. So the principle of explanation itself explains many different experiences, and you could think of it as a kind of inference to the best explanation of experiences. So there's a general principle that is a best explanation of experiences, or to use more neutral language, so that we don't use explanation, we could just say that there's a probabilistic reason to think that this principle of explanation is true, because the principle of explanation makes these experiences more likely than if that principle of explanation were not true. So there's a kind of Bayesian argument here for a principle of explanation from experience. Again, you come up with a general principle that it makes experiences more likely than in the absence of that general principle. Um, if there are more restricted principles, then those more restricted principles, and we can get more into this later if we want to, but just to kind of clarify the dialectic here, if you have a general principle like explain things as far as you can, and then somebody says, no, no, no,
Mm.
just explain chickens as far as you can. Well, well, what about the snakes, right? So if you're going to make a restricted principle, then unless you have a relevant reason to say, the chickens are relevantly different from the snakes, then it's an arbitrary restriction. And if you restrict it and you say only the chickens have an explanation, then you actually have evidence against the only based on your experience of other things having an explanation. Now, if you restrict it and you say, well, I want to do a modest principle, I'm going to say chickens have an explanation, but I'm not going to say only chickens have an explanation. I want to leave it open that the snakes do too. Well, then you can do that. But then that modest principle, actually, if it's true, it ends up being evidence for the more general principle. And that's because the more general principle makes that more specific principle more likely. Again, you use the Bayesian formula. The data is more likely on the principle than without the principle, and so then that means the data is evidence for the principle. So all this to say that I think there's an argument from experience for a general principle of explanation, and I think there are many general principles of explanation that are true, and that are actually mutually reinforcing. And so I kind of think of it as like an open project to see kind of what's the most general principle of explanation that explains or predicts the most, without
Mhm.
predicting problems, right? Like circularity
Okay.
or something. Um, so there are many principles, and if you know my work, you know that I kind of work with different principles. It's not because I think like I'm changing my mind about the principles, it's just that I think there's like an abundance of riches. Actually, there are multiple true principles, and some have certain advantages in certain contexts over others, in terms of presentation. But in terms of truth, I think there are many true principles, and so that's one kind of reason in support of a general principle of explanation. It's from experience. The other kind of reason, which you can anticipate, is the argument from just reasoning or intuition. The idea here is that it's the same basic faculty that underwrites logic, like the law of non-contradiction. That's a faculty of like a kind of deep intuition, that there's a sense. The way that I think about it is that logic is a light into the natures of things. So you can see that the nature of something precludes its opposite. Like in general, something can't be both square and not square. That's a general principle of reason that comes from insight into certain general natures. Um, and then we can apply that same basic faculty to other things. Like, so we can see that pine cones can't be prime numbers. Again, it's not because of the law of non-contradiction. Actually, it's just because basic insight into prime numbers and pine cones, they don't go together. So I'm identifying the general faculty that we have, that shows up in other domains, and then I'm suggesting that this general faculty of having insight in the natures of things also reveals, I think, that things. I want to use the language of call for an explanation, um, but more exactly, it's just that um, things with certain natures have an explanation. They must have an explanation. And I think it's actually possible to see that the difference between this microphone and these fingers is not relevant to breaking the call for an explanation. And that relevance there is something we sort of see by rational insight, I suggest. Like in the same way that you can sort of see by rational insight that increasing the prime number won't make it more likely to be a pine cone. You can see that like increasing the shape of the microphone won't make it more likely to just have no explanation. Right. So this is a principle. This is actually what convinced me. I was going to mention I used to be a skeptic of these general principles. I remember it was in grad school that something happened in me where there was this principle of irrelevant differences. It was like, yeah, what is the relevant difference between one size and another? And it seemed like something in my mind was like, wait, there's no relevant difference. I can just see that. Like, there surely is no prime number can be a pine cone. No shape can exist just on its own without an explanation. If any shape has an explanation, they're all uniformly alike in that way. So that's a way kind of motivating an argument from reason. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's interesting. So the first thing I'm thinking about when you say that is how this second motivation. So I can see how the first one would work in terms of sort of kind of inductive or empirical support for that general principle, because it predicts our evidence of finding explanations. But I'm maybe having a harder time grasping the idea that we can see just by rational insights or a priori that something demands an explanation in the sort of mystery reduction kind of sense. So thinking about, can I see that I should be able to answer a why question just purely by intellectually reflecting on the nature of something, and you're thinking that, well, there's a why question about that nature, and then I can just see in the same way that I can grasp the natures of pine cones and prime numbers that I should be able to answer that why question. I guess maybe I'm having a hard time at the moment seeing sort of what the
I
support for that
appreciate.
is, if you have
Yeah, I
any.
really do appreciate this. I think this is reminding me of my own state of kind of agnosticism or skepticism, because I don't think it's just a direct sight. At least I never really had the, sort of a direct sight that all natures have a further explanation. It's a combination of seeing a certain nature and then seeing that nature, if it were just unexplained, something in my mind goes crazy. Like this particular microphone is the uncaused cause of reality. It produced everything else. Nothing produced it. And then it just landed on Earth, and people just thought this was an ordinary microphone that was produced. That's just a coincidence. Actually, this is the one exception, right? So, um, something in my mind says that no, there's something about this microphone, um, its shape, its color, that wouldn't just exist on its own. So that's like a first bit. Now maybe we can zoom in on that too, and think about, okay, is that true? Do we have that intuition? And I even say we. I mean, this is very, in a sense, dependent on one's angle of consideration. So I want to be careful here in my language. Um, there's a certain angle of consideration where I orient myself in the abstract landscape of natures, and it's like, oh, that would have an explanation. Okay, so we can return to that. But then the second step has to do with the irrelevant differences, and this seemed to be like just the clearest to me, that merely changing the shape, from one shape to another. For me, it's easier with simple shapes. This microphone's too complicated. So think of like a triangle, and then think of a square. Now let's just say that I know, for whatever reasons, empirical reasons, or for whatever reasons, that the triangle, whether by reason or by empirical considerations, that the triangle has some explanation. And then somebody asks, well, would it make a difference if we change the number of vertices so it was a square? There's two questions here. One question is, can you see that the square is relevantly different from the triangle? That's one question. And then the second question is, can you see that it's not relevantly different from the triangle? Now, I think to the first question, I don't see that it's relevantly different. And that's actually enough to run a general principle of explanation, that the default expectation is to explain things unless you see a reason to break that inference. But I also think it's possible. I mean, and this has to do with actually thinking about the natures. This isn't something you just do without concentrating on the case. So just think about the square. You think about the triangle. Think about the triangle having an explanation, and then you ask, well, would this change in number of vertices make a difference to that explanatory requirement? And it seems to me, and I'm thinking about it again now, that it just seems clearly wouldn't. Like, it just wouldn't. Like, so if the one has an explanation, the other would have an explanation. That's how it strikes me. Either way, you could say there's a factive notion, and then what I'm hearing you say is that sort of insight into the natures of things might make the most sense in terms of the factive notion. It's like, if you can see that the number 9 can't be cut with a carving knife. You can sort of see that. Well, that's an insight into the nature of the 9 and the carving knife. It's not an insight into like your own thought about the 9, right? Like, fundamentally. And that basic point remains here. It's like the insight is into explanation, the sort of explanatory order, like apart from your awareness of it. Even if the explanatory order is grounded in some fundamental consciousness that exists apart
Yeah.
from your awareness of it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I realize now it's probably a good time to actually get into exactly what we mean by a limit. Also, thinking about how to sort of demarcate what a limit is, such that you can arrive at a conclusion which is something like what people are aiming for in
Yeah.
sort of at this stage of the cosmological argument, without the principle also applying to whatever you're trying to conclude with. And so I wonder
Right.
how you do that.
Yeah. So one idea is that a limit can be thought of as something that could be surpassed. So, like, if you have a limit in knowledge, then in principle, there could be more knowledge. If there could be more knowledge, right, then if there could be more knowledge in what you have, then you have a limit in knowledge. Now, I want to be careful with that, because the term could is sort of open to interpretation. Um, I like the idea of using the term could in the broadest sense. So one way I put this is, as long as it's compatible with the principles of reason, that is to say, um, that which can be discerned a priori, um, through just reflection, or reflection on the natures of things. I mean, ultimately, I think this, what I'm going to say, has to do with consistencies between natures, and consistencies between natures can, in principle, be seen a priori. So this is another case where there's a factive interpretation of what I'm saying and an epistemic interpretation of what I'm saying that I think actually meet at the horizon. Um, but just to kind of keep things modest and open, I'll just say that as long as there's no contradiction that could be derivable by any principle of reason, then I'll call it possible, like it could be. And so that way, um, so something that has knowledge such that there could be more knowledge, that knowledge will count as limited as long as there's no contradiction in there being something with more knowledge. And then an unlimited knowledge then would be something like the greatest possible knowledge, right? So that would be a way of thinking about it. Same like with a tree. Now there might be some things where like there is no greatest possible tree. I mean, this is one of the questions that will come up, right? Like, so for every tree, it is consistent with logic for there to be a larger tree, and there's no sort of like infinite tree that can't be surpassed. There's like a kind of incoherence there, and so I'm going to be having a discussion with Mike Humer about the existence of God. And one of the things that comes up in his work has to do with certain kinds of infinities that he thinks don't apply to reality. He calls these infinite intensities, infinite degrees, like a tree that's so large that it's larger than every finite tree. And so it's like infinitely intense in its size. He thinks there can't be those kind of infinities. And I agree with that. So I don't think there are infinitely large trees. So then the real question here is, if there's a fundamental reality that lacks limits, could it be infinite, or unlimited is really a better way to put it, without having a kind of infinite intensity? And I think so. I mean, that this is a prediction of my model, that it wouldn't have any infinite intensity at all. It would just be a kind of pure, complete, fundamental reality without limits and parameters. So it would have a kind of maximality, so it might have a kind of power that can't be surpassed, so it's unlimited in power. And then this will make predictions about other things that it can do, like it can know things, because if it couldn't, then there could, without contradiction, be a greater power.
So the way you were defining it, as far as I understood, was that it could be more than it is, and
Yeah,
in could, there wasn't that sort of conceivability or sort of a priori kind of
yeah,
consistency
consistent with
sense.
reason. Yeah,
Yeah. And okay, so because I was thinking through this before our entry, I'll just be fully transparent about what I'm thinking about. I was thinking about some of the ways that you define it in other work, I think had more to do with conceivably more or less. And that had to do with sort of there being degrees that are kind of in the vicinity of the degree that something is. And that struck me as providing reason to think that even a maximal degree would possibly be different. And then, so let's say if we're talking about a perfect being and we're thinking about the fact that it has sort of a neighbor in the vicinity immediately below perfection, maybe lacking one item of knowledge or lacking one power or
hmm
something, then that might give us some reason to think that it's possibly not perfect. But if perfection entails necessarily being perfect, then it looks like that would be evidence to think that it's not actually perfect. And one thing that actually I guess I'll bring up fully to hear your thoughts on was,
yeah,
it struck me that we have a lot of evidence for the possibility of different non-maximal degrees, including in, say, the source of everything else.
hmm
Perhaps more reason than just reason to think the maximal degree is possible, because there are so many other degrees that we also have support from experience and from experience, and then that's so the same kind of explanatory considerations that you offered. So I wonder what you think of that.
yeah. A couple of issues here. I mean, there's a certain sense in which non-maximal degrees could be included in the maximal degree. They don't have to be competing with each other. It's sort of like, if I have a $20 bill, that $20 bill is worth $20, and it's also worth $10. I mean, at least the $10 is sort of included in the $20, if you will. So you could think of the maximal realities including all the others. Um, the point here is a modest point. It doesn't preclude the existence of those degrees. Um, to the first thought here about the more or less, right? So the idea is maximal, so there's no possibility of being more. And then I wanted to say that, and yeah, in my other works, I also point out that there's not just like immediate neighbor of it being less. This might apply to those infinite intensities where there's something to an infinitely intense degree, but then you say, well, what if you just like remove like one node? So for example, it has knowledge to an infinitely intense degree, but we just subtract from it one little small item of knowledge, right? Um, and then that would kind of call for an explanation, like, well, why is it at that degree rather than just slightly less, right? If it could be just slightly less. One thought I've had about this is that I'm not sure it's really coherent to remove just one item of knowledge without removing like infinite categories of knowledge. So you say that it doesn't know a particular pine cone. Okay, well then if it doesn't know that particular pine cone, then it doesn't know that I'm thinking about that particular pine cone. It doesn't know that that particular pine cone is next to a turtle. It doesn't know that because it doesn't know anything about that particular pine cone. And I can multiply examples so that actually we're subtracting an infinite amount of knowledge by identifying one small gap. And I don't really see how to just remove a small gap to get one less from a maximal knowledge. Same with power. I've thought about this in terms of power. If there's this one thing that it can't do, it can't lift 5 pounds. That's the one thing that it can't do. Well, can it lift 10 pounds? I mean, 5 pounds is included in 10 pounds, right? So this is going back to the idea that the smaller is included in the larger. If it can't lift 5 pounds, then how can it lift 10 pounds? I mean, that seems incoherent. So if it can't lift 5 pounds, it can't lift 10 pounds, it can't lift 20 pounds, it can't lift any of those. And that's like an infinite subtraction away from the thing that can just lift any number of pounds. So yeah, I wonder what you think about that in terms of sort of clarifying connection. Like, actually, if it was unsurpassable, then it follows that there's not just finite neighbors next to it. It's just
Yeah.
that, yeah, otherwise there's just a kind of incoherence there.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. I mean, I think that definitely resolves kind of my own formulation of the word just then. And I was thinking if there were other formulations that might kind of survive that response. I was thinking
Yeah,
about
maybe.
whether there might
I
be
like
a
this
way of
instinct. Yeah.
construing it. Yeah, whether there might be ways of construing it in terms of sort of percentages or proportions or something,
Mm,
rather than saying we're subtracting one item of knowledge or something. Maybe we're just going on a really kind of close by percentage of knowledge.
yeah,
Maybe there's
right.
something there to be done. Although it's a little tricky with the source of infinities that we're talking about. But
It is because if we're talking about the real numbers, there's not like the immediate next to. I mean, this is maybe a clue. This is maybe another way of actually arguing for what I want to argue for, that there is no immediate next to, because if you think of it in terms of percentages, there's no like, what's the highest percentage less than 100%? Is it 99.9%? Well, no, because is it 99.999? No, there is no highest. Yeah.
yeah, well, okay, so I will ask one more question then, but I'm going to frame it now in terms of another topic because you've done work in so-called modal epistemology. So that's how we come to have sort of rational beliefs or knowledge about what's possible and necessary and impossible. And that work suggests that, well, I might let you summarize that maybe, but just before you do that, I will just say that um, this could potentially be now a worry that we could address at the same time, which would be to go back to that first worry. And instead, just to point out that I think what you said about how there's no immediate neighbor to the maximum is going to be true of any other degree as well. There's sort of no immediate neighbor right next to anything else if what you said about maximality holds true. A similar point could be made about the numbers, right? Sort of
Mhm.
there's no closest number to any other number. So I wonder maybe if we could talk about a bit of your work on so-called modal continuity and then how that might apply to this issue.
Yeah. So one idea that you might be pointing to is a way of motivating the possibility of a maximal reality through what you called modal continuity. So I have a few different publications where I motivate this principle that, like, things that are possible are next to other things that are possible. And there's actually a book I discovered, and it's kind of more for like business and like ideas. It's not really a philosophy book, but it's called The Adjacent Possible. And one of my friends let me know about that book and let me know about it, referred the book to me, and I read it. And I thought this is really amazing. This is all about how when we have technological advances, it opens up new possibilities that are adjacent to what we've achieved. So possibilities are kind of like next to other possibilities. And in my work, I motivate the general principle that, okay, well, if X is possible, and then if Y differs from X in some mere degree, then I have some reason to think that Y is also possible, right? Unless I have some independent reason to think that that degree is a relevant difference here. So one could argue for the possibility of a maximal reality by saying, look, a maximal reality, maximal being, let's say, is modally continuous with non-maximal degrees of being. It's just a difference in degree of greatness, or degree of being, or degree of knowledge, or degree of power, whatever the parameter is that you want to use. But that difference in degree is not apparently a relevant difference. We can't sort of see that once you go from this degree of power to the unlimited degree of power, that now we've broken the possibility there. And then that would give us some independent reason to think that unlimited power or maximal greatness is possible. Now, a couple further thoughts about this. So the first is, notice how this is different than a maximal natural number, or let's say a maximal integer. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those are integers, and you go all the way up till you get the maximal integer. Well, there's reason to think, I mean, you might label it, it's omega, that omega is what we call an infinite integer, and then there's omega plus 1 and omega minus 1, so those do have neighbors, right? But it has no finite neighbors, because omega minus 1 is still infinite. And it's like, well, what infinite is it? I mean, it's like the same infinite as omega. How is it really different? Well, you just say, omega minus 1 is less than omega. Okay, so this is debatable. People argue that there is no actual infinite quantity like that. There's puzzles about that, reasons to think that that quantity is not really a coherent quantity. So then that would be a reason to break the uniformity with respect to the possibility of a maximal number. There's a kind of coherence problem. So you could, it's not really an analogy, just by the same reasoning, you could think maybe there's an independent reason similar to think that maximal being is incoherent. And that's an important project. I mean, there's all sorts of arguments for the incoherence of a maximal being. But just to follow the dialectic, the argument here is we have some initial motivation to think that maximal reality is possible by modal continuity. And now it kind of shifts the burden to someone who's arguing for the impossibility there. So it's not just we're completely agnostic about it. Like, I have no idea if it's possible or not. We have some reason to think that there could be this maximal reality. So that's my first thought about how one could, in principle, break the modal continuity, just like you do with the numbers. You could do that with being, okay, maximal being. My second thought, and I think this is actually my more important thought, which is relevant to our conversation about cosmological arguments, is that no cosmological argument, no argument from limits that I offer requires a prior belief or even reason to believe in the possibility of a maximal being. In fact, you can think of my argument for a maximal being as an explanation of non-maximal pieces of reality as a reason to think that a maximal being is actual and therefore possibly actual. So the reason to think it's possible is because you already have a reason to think that it's actual. Robert Koons makes this point somewhere in one of his works. And I remember when I first read it, just my mind was excited by that. I was like, oh yeah, that sounds beautiful, right? Like this has to do with answering a certain kind of Kantian objection that the cosmological argument reduces to the ontological argument, and the ontological argument fails for various reasons. And you don't want to get stuck defending the ontological argument in order to defend the cosmological argument, unless you have to, right? And it seemed like, well, yeah, I mean, you don't have to have some reason to think that this maximal being is possible or coherent. First, to have a reason to think that through the explanatory argument that it's actual, and then therefore would have to be possible. Now, If you do have that independent reason to think that maximal being is incoherent or impossible, then that will defeat both my cosmological argument. Well, actually, what it does, it doesn't necessarily defeat it. It just adds a weight of a reason on the other side of it. So you could have a kind of cognitive dissonance for a while that could lead to greater wisdom. Um, but then it would also challenge the ontological argument as well. So you can sort of see I have a kind of ontological argument here. It's like, here's a reason to think that maximal greatness is possible. This is my value argument that I gave in some other context. It's a certain kind of degree. Degrees are modally uniform. I mean, there's other reasons to sort of challenge that ontological argument. Others have pointed out some considerations that I think, yeah, I mean, there's more work to be done there. But in any case, if you have an independent reason to doubt the possibility, that will defeat both of these, or weigh against both of these style of arguments. And so, just in conclusion, just to kind of repeat and cap this off, we can separate the argument for the possibility of a maximal being from a kind of argument from limits for the actuality of a maximal being. We don't need that modal epistemology. We just don't need it for the argument from
Okay.
limits.
Yeah, okay. So then that might provide an extra motivation insofar as you can motivate the possibility, and that entails
Yeah.
actuality, but maybe the deeper point has to do with considerations to do with explanation that we just talked about, and maybe that's kind of a fundamental motivation.
Now, here, if I may, I mean, here's where maybe an argument, the modal continuity can come in to support the argument from sort of irrelevant differences. So the idea here is that, I said that the differences between one limit and another, one shape and another, is not relevant to break the call for further explanation. And we could do this in terms of possible explanations. So in How Reason Can Lead to God, I give this kind of secret argument at the end. In one of my drafts, I actually called it like a secret argument, and I had a bunch of blank pages where you just think the book ended. I always kind of like this thing where it's like there's something special that you just discover. It's like, a movie that ends and the credits go up and then people walk out. And then, well, there's secret scenes at the end, that people want to stay for, those movies. Well, I love that idea. That concept is very cool. You put a treasure in there and you don't assume everybody will find it. That's part of what makes it special to find it. I did this in my marriage proposal. I created a scavenger hunt with a treasure at the end, which was the proposal, but it was through a series of messages that she had to find, and she may never find them, right? So there's just something interesting about that. So I did that in this book, and the publisher there didn't recommend I do that, right? But it's still in the book, so it's an argument at the end. It's not just called the secret argument or something. It's more just in there at the end of the bridge, and it's an argument from possible explanations. So there I say that even if there are things that have no explanation, there's no contradiction with reason for the possibility of an explanation. So even if you think like this microphone, like there's no explanation of this microphone, it's one of the things that just appeared from nothing. Well, is it a contradiction with reason for there to be an explanation of the microphone? If there's no contradiction from reason, then we can actually build an argument for a maximal being in a kind of more sophisticated way. And one way to support the argument is to use this modal continuity, that if there's no contradiction in reason for this phone to be explained, then changing its shape or size or limits in any way is not going to break that possibility. And so any kind of limited reality, any kind of imperfect or less than maximal reality is possibly explained. Now, that's not a premise, that's a conclusion that's derived from this principle of modal continuity, which gives support for that general principle. And then from there, in that sort of secret part of the book, it's not really secret, but at the end, then I derive then the possibility of a maximal thing that's a possible explanation of the non-maximal things. And then from there, argue from the nature of a maximal reality that either it's the kind of thing that's impossible, or it's the kind of thing that's necessary, because it's the kind of thing that has its maximality across the maximal number of possibilities. It's maximal in its nature and it's maximal in its existence. So it's either impossible or necessary. So if it's not impossible, in other words, it's possible, then it follows that it's necessary and therefore actual. So it's kind of a fun argument there, that will depend on modal epistemology, um,
Yep.
in support of that.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. Well, make sure to link that then in the description so people can actually go take a look at that and see it more in depth because that's a little bit more complicated. But I was thinking as you were talking that that does solve at least one kind of problem with the other way of construing the motivation from modal continuity to a maximal being. In that, I mean, so part of what I'm hearing is that with respect to limited beings, there's sort of no reason to break the continuity with respect to possible explanations.
Yes,
But with respect to a maximal being, then you do have a positive reason because maybe its maximality precludes being
you
explained.
got it.
And so
Yeah,
then you get that asymmetry. Yeah. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah,
beautiful.
that makes
Yeah,
sense. Okay. So then, okay, the last thing I wanted to address, so we can try to do that for maybe some of the remaining time, is sometimes in your work you've motivated the greater likelihood of a perfect nature, maximal nature, by looking at that being somehow simple or intrinsically probable for one reason or another. So that is its probability prior to looking at evidence like the empirical evidence in support of these principles. And so I thought maybe it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on how you think of simplicity, how you're thinking that that motivates the greater likelihood of perfect or maximal nature. Yeah.
I love this question so much because it points to the broader project. So the broader project is to understand the fundamental nature of reality. And I suggest that there are two broad strategies for doing that. One strategy is to do that through analyzing just the nature of fundamental reality and seeing what could possibly be fundamental. The other strategy is by considering the effects in the world and then considering what would best explain those effects or what would make those effects most likely. So the first kind of argument is, you might think of it as a deductive argument. You sort of deduce the conclusion through the pure light of reason. I mean, together with the observation that something exists, right? But that's like all you need. Actually, you don't even need that. You just need the possibility of something. So um, I'm not even sure if you need that as a problem. Anyway, let me not get sidetracked. So it's a nice, pure sort of logical argument that I'm not calling it an ontological argument, because it makes use of principles of explanation, cause, and effect. And that's in contrast with this kind of argument from probability, where it's a kind of predictive argument. Both of these strategies can come under the argument from arbitrary limits. So you can think of the argument from arbitrary limits as having these two forms, the sort of deductive form and the probabilistic form. So we've been talking about the deductive form of the argument from arbitrary limits. It's like there's no relevant difference between one limited thing and another. And so then to avoid circularity, the ultimate explanation of limited things is going to have to be in terms of something unlimited. Well, what would that be? I mean, it can't just be unlimited in one dimension, but then be limited in another, because in that other dimension in which it's limited still calls for that further explanation. So it has to be sort of purely unlimited. And so, well, if it has a kind of maximal nature that fills out what it is fundamentally, then that's like the only way that it could lack some further explanation. It's the only way it could be fundamental. And this is consistent with the contingency argument. Contingency has to do with, you might think of like limit with respect to its modal profile. It doesn't span all possible worlds; it just spans some of them. And so that's where you get the argument from contingency. But this argument from limits is sort of a deeper argument. It supports the argument from contingency, but also supports other kinds of arguments to explain all the finite parameters. Okay, so now we can turn to the other kind of argument from limits, which is an argument from probability. And then this argument is going to have kind of like two parts to it. So one part has to do with the nature of the hypothesis, and then the other part has to do with how that hypothesis explains the data. So the nature of the hypothesis, you mentioned simplicity. The way I'm thinking about this hypothesis is that it has a kind of simplicity, meaning that it doesn't include independent pieces or parts in the description of what it is that themselves would call for further explanation. Um, it's basically like the most unified thing that we could describe. And this is a way of multiplying unnecessary assumptions. So, like if you have a theory of fundamental reality, call this the turtle snake theory. Put aside the deductive argument. Put aside that turtles and snakes have further explanation. Just put that aside. Let's just say we're just thinking about the probability argument, and we think, okay, let's posit a turtle snake, and then that will explain why there's things in the world. It has these powers. It's like, well, by positing a turtle and a snake, why are you positing those things? Like, what's motivating those posits? If you could explain things just in terms of a turtle, and adding the snake is completely unnecessary, then adding the snake diminishes the intrinsic probability of the hypothesis. So if I want to find what's the most intrinsically probable hypothesis, it's going to have the least number of independent parameters, if that makes sense. So I think that the maximal being hypothesis is actually a nice candidate for a unified, simple hypothesis. And it's kind of an open challenge. Like, can you think of another hypothesis whose conceptual parts are as simple that also has the same kind of predictive success or power? So the nice thing about the maximal being hypothesis is that it has all these predictions. It's going to make it more likely that there's knowledge in the world because this thing will have knowledge. It can make it more likely that there's maybe an array of interesting experiences because this thing will have a kind of maximal awareness of value, including the value for having unfolding experiences and development of various kinds. It will increase the probability that there'll be a kind of moral landscape, a sense of right and wrong. And even if, I mean, there's debates about how to analyze right and wrong, whether it's objective or subjective. But even if it is like subjective, there's still the experience of right and wrong. And that's a very specific kind of experience. That's different than just experiencing hot or experiencing happy. It's a very specific kind of like the experience of, oh, that's not right, or that's wrong. And so that specific experience is included in reality. Well, if the fundamental reality is maximal, then it has that sort of maximal capacity to be acquainted with all these different kinds of experiences. And I would argue it would have a kind of pure goodness in itself, which creates a kind of foundation for even distinguishing right from wrong. There are different ways and systems to analyze this. What I like about the maximality thesis is that it's actually very flexible across a range of different metaethical systems, from constructivism to subjectivism to objectivism of various sorts. Deontology, consequentialism, all of these are compatible with this basic theory, and the basic theory actually makes it more likely that there's some kind of moral order. And so we just go through the different things that we observe in the world, and we see, oh, all those things seem to be more likely given this hypothesis than without the hypothesis. Or maybe we don't have to say they're more likely than not. We could just say that it raises the expectation or makes it more likely, um, by at least 1%. It's just more likely than otherwise. So that's a style of argument. And the main worry is that maybe it's too predictive. Maybe it predicts the world should be better than it is, and that's an important kind of worry. But that's the kind of argument from probability, from arbitrary limits. And I'm glad you're drawing this out because I'm not sure if I've really drawn it out so explicitly like this anywhere else. That there are these two different types of arguments from arbitrary limits: the deductive form and the probability form, and both are useful. And I think they are mutually amplifying, like two independent witnesses for
Mhm.
that conclusion.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I mean, I like the idea that there might be. I mean, one thing that I worry about with deductive arguments is that obviously there's sort of an implicit assumption about what the. I mean, depending on your analysis of what's going on here, there might be an implicit assumption about what the relative likelihoods are of the different premises and
Uh-huh.
negations of those
Right. Point.
premises. And
Yeah.
so I like the probabilistic forms because it sort of brings all of that to light and makes it explicit. Um, and about the simplicity point, I was thinking, so you were talking about sort of episemically independent components, and that sort of perfection maybe seems to not have different episemically independent components, or at least it's very unified. And I wanted
Yes.
to maybe think through what that means exactly, because I mean, there's one sense in which you might think it does have epistemically independent components, namely sort of logically equivalent to a big conjunction of different properties. At least it entails those properties. But it's not just that it
Well, it
entails
entails
them,
it
right? It's
entails
that,
them. It
yeah,
entails them. But that's very
yeah,
different than all those properties are built into the core hypothesis.
Yes.
Would you
And
like
then
me to
how are you
elaborate
thinking
on?
of that difference? Yeah, yeah. Well, it'd be useful just to hear how you're thinking about that difference.
Yeah, right. No, this is so important. I mean, because I mean, technically, every hypothesis entails infinitely many things. I mean, think about this, like the hypothesis that what's a good hypothesis? There's no gremlins in this closet. Okay, that makes it more likely that you're not going to see some gremlins coming on the screen. I mean, I guess I could be holding. They could be scared. I could be holding them at bay. But okay, so it's a hypothesis, and let me do the hypothesis that's easier to verify. So the, I mean, nobody's worried about whether there's gremlins in my closet, but I mean, just to get very crystal clear, that this microphone won't disappear in 2 seconds. Okay, 1, 2. All right, didn't disappear. We verified that. Okay, great. So we have that hypothesis. Now, that hypothesis actually um, has infinitely many implications, because this microphone not disappearing in 2 seconds implies that um, either it doesn't disappear in 2 seconds, or, and then you can put any ors, anything. There's drafts or whatever it is, because the the original hypothesis will imply all those disjunctive hypotheses. So there's like infinitely many. Um, we can also add ands, like so. Um, this hypothesis that this microphone doesn't disappear in a certain time implies that hypothesis together with all the mathematical truths, right? Because the mathematical truths are implied by everything, right? Um, so we can continue to give more and more examples of how every hypothesis trivially implies infinitely many hypotheses, and it doesn't follow that therefore every hypothesis is sort of infinitely complex. Is my point. The point here is that the complexity of what's implied is just different from the complexity of what's built into the original hypothesis. And when you look at the original hypothesis, I think that's where you look for how many independent units are there, independent parameters are there. That's the relevant complexity. I think that makes sense of our ordinary reasoning. When we're considering a hypothesis like, did it rain last night? Well, the trees are wet. My son was asking me on the way to school, is it raining? Well, it was kind of cloudy. He was wondering if it was going to rain. Well, it ended up raining a little bit later, but it seemed like it rained last night because the grass was wet, the tree tops, were wet, lots of wet there. Now somebody says, well, here's a hypothesis. It's not that it just rained last night. It's that there was some boy who had a bucket of water and he poured it on your sidewalk, and some girl who had a hose and poured it on, sprayed it on the trees. You don't see any of those things. This is part of the hypothesis. Okay, well, both the rain hypothesis and the sort of more complex hypothesis of the boy and the girl, and we can add more to it to cover all the places. Um, they both entail infinitely many things. They both have infinite entailments. Um, but the rain hypothesis is intrinsically simpler in what it in the core hypothesis. So I'm drawing this out in a bit of detail because this is a point that's often missed out there. That what's implied, the complexity of what's implied, is not the same as the complexity of the core hypothesis. So the core hypothesis of a maximal being, I think that implies you can draw out maximal qualities of power, and then from maximal power, I think you can get the power to know, which gives you a quality of knowledge, or knowledge power at least, and that continue, and then I think you can get goodness. Richard Swinburne is sort of famous for drawing out these entailments between the divine attributes. Well, this is a way of teasing out some non-trivial implications. They're not part of the complexity of the original hypothesis. In fact, actually, the fact that you can derive, knowledge, power, and goodness from this core hypothesis, and then you find in the world things that are more likely given knowledge, power, and goodness, that's evidence for that more core hypothesis. So that's how I'm thinking about complexity.
Okay. And then how? So I was thinking maybe part of what's going on is what you're saying is that so everything has infinitely many implications. So the implications can't itself just make the intrinsic probability of every theory sort of, I don't know, infinitesimal or something.
Yeah.
But then I wonder whether maybe part of what we're doing is also just thinking through asymmetries, right? So, I mean, it's true that so the theory that, I don't know, the foundation of reality is your microphone, and the theory that at the foundation of reality is a perfect being. Those both have infinitely many implications. Many of them overlap, right? I mean, they both imply all mathematical truths and other necessary
Yes, right.
truths.
Yep.
So I guess probably, correct me if I'm wrong, I assume what you're pointing to is you think that there's some asymmetry between the two, such that the perfect being theory carries less complexity costs than the microphone theory. But then I wonder whether part of what's going on is we're looking to see where there's not an overlap in their implications, or whether that might come into play. So I wonder what you think of that.
Yeah, that may be right. I mean, something I wonder too here is how much arbitrariness might be playing a role too. I mentioned simplicity, but I mean, there's also a kind of uniformity to a kind of like purely maximal fundamental reality versus the microphone has not just a more complexity in its description, but also a kind of arbitrary limits, which infect the intrinsic probability. Um, so it's not just that the arbitrary limits call for further explanation; it's that the limits seem to be less sort of intrinsically likely. Now, I mean, maybe that's just because they imply in the core hypothesis uh, extra complexity. But there's something there about the arbitrariness of the limits and the independent parameters that seem to kind of go together. And I don't, it's not perfectly clear to me kind of how they're related, but it does seem very intuitive that the more complex and more arbitrary hypothesis is going to be less likely. Now, there is the issue of modesty. Um, so, Paul Draper talks about, I mean, you're familiar with this, that a hypothesis that's less modest is a hypothesis that it's going to have a lower intrinsic probability. It's less modest; it like sticks itself out more. I mean, and there is a certain sense in which the perfection is less modest, not just because of its entailments, but maybe something along the lines of what you were saying, that there's something it implies about reality, or just there's something in it. I Paul and I, we had this kind of longish email correspondence a few years back about what modesty really comes to. I mean, initially it seemed like maybe we were going to try to define it in terms of entailments, but then it seemed tricky to really do that. And then it seemed like, well, maybe there's just this sort of basic way of thinking about it. That continues to sort of be just an open question for me. But Paul likes uniformity, so he thinks uniformity makes it more intrinsically likely. Maybe that plays into making it more coherent. So yeah, so in a way, maybe there's a little bit of a trade-off. The perfection hypothesis becomes less modest, but then it has more coherence, and that kind of helps balance it out. Um, yeah, I think I want to say I think there's work to be done here in getting this sharper, for sure.
I think so. I mean, I think one of the issues, at least I've come up against in some of my own sort of recent writing, is when trying to think through sort of a two-step process where you first account for modesty and then account for the probabilistic relations between the different entailments or known entailments. And that process isn't really straightforward, because just given modesty, any sort of infinitely specific theory is kind of hard to see how to assign it a prior probability just given modesty that isn't just zero. And so that ends up looking, yeah, sort of tricky. So I agree that there's sort of a lot of work to be done here on how to work that out. And that's not a problem specifically just for this, just to be clear, right? I mean, this is a problem, a
Yeah,
general problem for just specific theories, including all sorts of things that people talk about. So
yeah, that's well put. Something else I've been wondering about here is, I mean, there's a way of thinking about like maximality as a kind of infinitely specific hypothesis that makes it like maybe unlikely. But then there's a few considerations that kind of push back against that. So one has to do with what I said earlier about it including all the other values. So it's like that $10 bill that includes the values of the fewer dollars as well in what it is. So it's not excluding them; it's like including them. Almost like it's the the least arbitrary possible way to be and like the most inclusive possible way to be. I mean, I guess you could say that it's maximally specific, but it's not in the way that like the color green, like a sharp shade of green, is maximally specific because it doesn't include all the other colors. It might be like if you could think of white as including all the other colors, but then like white is maximally specific. Well, I don't know. I mean, but then if you say white precludes green, then it doesn't really include green. So this is where I wonder if like the color examples, because Draper likes the color examples to kind of highlight that specificity. And I'm wondering if they're kind of importantly disanalogous to the idea of a maximal foundation, that the maximal foundation really does literally include within it like all the other decrees. It's just not to the exclusion, right? Like, so because if you have green to any degree, that will preclude blue to any degree. But if you have a $10 bill, that like includes the $5 of value, right? So that's one thing I've considered there, which I've never actually shared or articulated. It's just in my mind that I've been thinking. So I'm glad for the opportunity to share this thought here. There's work to clarify that. The other thing, let's see. Oh yeah, the other thing I've been kind of wondering about is if that sort of maximality property, that's not really even the most fundamental property. That there's something more about like an existence that lacks limits. So that's saying what it isn't. That's removing it. And then like what's left? Well, maybe I want to say something like it's just like purely positive or something. Like, or like it's, or maybe it's like powerful, or even just like consciousness or something. And then there's something that I say that is not building in the idea of a maximal something. It's prior to this modal notion. It's like pure something, like pure isness, like pure, maybe like pure awareness or something, like pure stuff. I hardly know the language for this. And then you deduce maximal greatness as one of the implications. So maximal greatness isn't the sort of foundational concept. It's actually derived out of it. And I've wondered if that also might help with this kind of specificity worry. It's like purely what it is. It's purely general. It's the least specific that a thing could be. And that, well, of course, entails that it is something specific. So, yeah.
That makes sense. I mean, obviously this is complicated, so
Does that make sense?
I don't think we're gonna.
There's a lot here.
It does make
I'm
sense.
sharing all this. This is kind of like a messy spaghetti thing that I'm putting out here because there's lots of strands, and we need more people working on the strands to clean this up and clarify this, because I think we can do that. I think some of the most beautiful structures are created with lots of resources. And so I think there are many conceptual pieces here, different notions of simplicity, different notions of probability, intrinsic probability, and to kind of have all those pieces and really get them cleared and worked out, I think can help us. But I will say that at my present moment, in the present moment, my working hypothesis is that the fundamental reality is like the least arbitrary possible, like the most basic, most complete in a way in what it is fundamentally, and sort of the most intrinsically likely possible, actually. That there's no more intrinsically likely hypothesis that one could even conceive of. But my general challenge is, see if you can come up with a hypothesis that has fewer conceptual parts and has the same explanatory and predictive success. And I have not seen anybody even propose this. Not only haven't I seen it done, I haven't even seen somebody propose a candidate. So, I mean, if it's out there, I haven't seen it. And I mean, this would be a great publication, like here's a hypothesis that competes with this sort of maximal supreme being or perfection hypothesis that's as simple in terms of how many parts and as predictively successful. I mean, that would be quite an amazing thing. I mean, and that point, it's sort of like just this great challenge, is see if we can do it. And then I think that too will help us get clear on the concepts. Because I think my prediction is what will happen is somebody watching this or somebody just thinking about this will come up with some competing hypotheses and develop them. And then there'll be a question about, okay, is this, what notion of complexity is being used here? What notion of prediction is being used here? And that will also clarify the project together.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah. I mean, actually, this is something that excites me a lot. It's something I've been thinking about a lot as well, because it strikes me that a lot of conversations, I've been watching different YouTube videos about the evidence, about fine tuning and so on. And I mean, it turns out that with anything, you can always sort of limit the variables such that the only things that are now relevant are the priors. And so this has been a really big kind of online discussion, and people seem to be really interested in Paul Draper's account of intrinsic probability, where you weigh the modesty and the coherence or uniformity.
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying strikes me as correct, that probably something like that perfect theory is going to be the most uniform or the most coherent. And so, at least among equally specific alternatives, it's going to be the most likely. And then there's just a question about how to manage that trade-off and then how much
Yeah.
dependence
Right.
factors in. But
Yeah.
yeah. So I've been thinking about combining two of your ideas, and I think that this helps a little bit with the modesty point, at least when thinking about a conscious foundation for the
Hmm.
rest of reality. And so I was thinking about your counting argument, which, just to summarize for everybody else, is this argument where you sort of talk about thoughts that can be about distinct pluralities of non-thoughts or non-mental items. And then because, so by Cantor's theorem, it turns out that the thoughts about those pluralities will outnumber the particular pluralities as long as you have certain assumptions that are met, which allows the thoughts to be sort of distinguished from one another. And I was thinking about a version of this where you have, rather than axioms, as you have it in a lot of your published work, that might have to do with grounding, or some other sort of kind of factive notion, even if it's sort of a priori or something, but sort of about what the actual logical relations are. You sort of instead have a weaker set of axioms that just have to do with what is epistemically possible. So about what entailments are known, and
Hmm.
that will at least tell you that the sort of number of epistemically possible properties that are mental vastly outnumber the number of epistemically possible thoughts that are non-mental. And there's sort of a bridge there that I don't think might be a little complicated, but at least there's an interesting thought there, I think, in terms of that might in some way make the theory that the foundation is mental more modest than the theory that it's non-mental, because sort of most ways the world might be include mentality by a
Hmm.
vast majority.
Hmm. That's fascinating. Um, yeah, right. That I hadn't thought about that before, but I'm seeing the idea that this is actually quite interesting. That if you think about this sort of the landscape of the ways things can be, and if it turns out that there are more mental ways than non-mental ways, then it's more likely. Oh yeah, no, it would seem to follow right off the bat that you just throw the dart into that landscape of ways things can be, and if it's actually a smaller portion of it is non-mental, then you're not going to expect the fundamental reality to just happen to be non-mental. It's more likely that it would be mental. That's actually very exciting. Like this is I'm having the moment of, oh, I'm seeing something new. I never saw that.
Yeah.
Um, that's fascinating. I never thought about that counting argument as having an implication for the prior probability. I mean, because I do have this article somewhere where I'm kind of thinking through. It's in draft form. That if there's more mental stuff, then there's a reason to think that more mental possibilities that um, that the mind is fundamental. The basic principle I had there was that the more fundamental reality can build more things than the less fundamental reality. And so if the more things is in the realm of mind, that's evidence that the fundamental reality is mental, that can build more things. But your idea here is actually different. I mean, it's consistent with that and actually even amplifies it in a way, but it is different. It has to do with the intrinsic probability. It's a reason to think that the mind first hypothesis or fundamental mind is intrinsically more likely based on the counting argument.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And all that you need is the epistemic versions of the axioms, which strike me as, rather than sort of supported by intuition, strike me as just kind of like empirical facts about what we
Hmm.
actually know.
Yeah, you can work with a more modest. a more modest version of the argument as well. That's a second advantage. I'd have to think more about that second one, but that might be right. Um, I mean, and even just making the connection between the counting argument's conclusion and the intrinsic probability, even if you, yeah, this is a nice point. You can get to this. You can use an epistemic pathway that's more modest. Yeah, write this up. I think this is a publishable idea. This
I
is,
appreciate that. I actually, so I currently have, I've just done a review and resubmit on a paper about this. So
oh
I'll,
yeah,
sometime I'd love to hear your thoughts, because actually I don't just talk about the greater modesty, but I think once you have that proportion claim, then you also get this structure where, um, so you could do the same constructions with respect to powers. And so then if you have a foundation that has some power, then it's going to be far more likely to have some mental powers than to have no mental powers. And
I
if
see.
you then sort of build in that it doesn't have any mental powers, so not only is that immodest, but it also ends up suffering from a sort of incoherence, because it
Mhm.
has a power, but it lacks all mental powers, and
Uh
most
huh.
powers are mental. So,
Yeah.
so I end up, yeah, arguing that sort of on a very straightforward reading of Paul Draper's account of intrinsic probability, it's both less coherent and less modest by many orders of magnitude. So I use your work everywhere. So
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I just hadn't seen that connection, and I see it now. It's just exciting. It's like very pleasurable to see this.
that's great.
It's
Yeah,
like the
I appreciate
discovery
that.
in the landscape of ideas. It's like, oh, this idea leads to over there. That's a nice corridor over there. So yeah, thank you for sharing
Yeah,
that.
thank you. Yeah, yeah, I was
This is
just
like a
wanted to
highlight
point it
of the whole conversation. I think I'm
out.
excited for
Okay.
people to see this.
That's good. Yeah, I'm really excited. Yeah, and I think what was exciting to me also about talking with you was just hearing more of your thoughts, because I mean, obviously this is so inspired by your work, and I actually wanted to maybe close off by just telling you that almost everything I've thought about, maybe for the past, like, I don't know how many years of my life, has in some way or other been trying to engage more reflectively with your work. Um, yeah, you inspired a lot of thoughts. I mean, ultimately, I came to more of a position of thinking that sort of Paul Draper's way of looking at things was maybe an approximation of the right way of looking at things. But then trying to think through, okay, well, how I share some of your intuitions, how can I map that onto this methodology or this account and see where those two marry? And so that's been kind of the last few years of my life. So you've been very inspiring, is the point. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. That inspires me. And I think, we don't always know how much we inspire each other. But I'll sometimes get messages that inspire me in ways that the people who sent me those messages like would have no idea. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So yeah, to close off, then I just wanted to know, because you talked about how all of this, the principles, they are applicable sort of to a wider range of topics, including more practically applicable topics than it might initially seem. And so that kind of brings me to thinking about, well, if you had a piece of advice for helping people think more clearly, not just about this, but anything, sort of a very important piece of advice, doesn't have to be the most important, but some
Mhm.
very important piece of advice that's been on your heart or mind lately, what would that be that you could share with us?
I would go back to that kind of first point about that aim, and not giving up on that. I think it's in the places where life is the most complex and the most messy that it's both like the hardest to keep that aim up, um, but also potentially the most rewarding because you have more pieces to organize into something more profoundly beautiful. I really appreciate the side of the pain because a lot of times what happens is there is a persistence that seems to persistently result in blocks and getting stuck and feeling like there's not that breakthrough. And that's where I think we do need each other. I mean, sometimes a person can go so far on their own, and then there's a certain friend or community, and there's more lights together, and we can create more beauty out of more messes, in cooperation. That's another important point about kind of the work that I'm inspired about, which is instead of just debating each other and competing with each other, seeing how to work with each other as allies in this larger quest to understand reality, because there's always more to see. And so that would be my kind of final take home advice. I mean, the principles of power in worldview design are the same as in design or life development, and I think it comes down to that aim of like, okay, here's the tension, here's the confusion, here's the place where things are messy in my life and in my worldview. Um, don't give up seeking to bring order to that, because when there's those breakthroughs, that's where you get the greatest treasures, in my experience. The conceptual knots that have stayed with me as I've just kept coming back to them, kept coming back to them, and then resolve something. A lot of times it's in a spiral. It's like, here's a little bit of a resolution. Whoa, that helped me. I didn't see that before. Um, and then there's this kind of a spiral because I want to just add this. I think this is important and will be meaningful to some people, and it has to do with the lessons we learn again and again in new ways. I think for me, the pain of aspects of reality being like uncertain and aspects of my life being uh, uncertain or disorganized, together with the great pleasure of discovering that treasure, discovering those secret pages at the end of the book, or just that treasure that you didn't know if that treasure was there to be found. And maybe you were searching for a treasure and it wasn't that one. The one to be found is actually greater than what you were searching for, because what you were searching for had a form of the real thing, but the form of it that wasn't real. It had a break because the real thing is is deeper in. It's more connected. It's more what you actually want, but you don't know that. So I'll have this experience of there being a spiral. By spiral, I mean it's like there's one episode of discovery, and then there's more pain, more questions, more uncertainties, and then there's another episode of discovery. In some areas of my life, it seems like, well, the spirals are more just in the realm of excitement after excitement. And in other areas, it's like, well, this is maybe my deepest growth. It's like, okay, there's pain here. Well, let me come back. And then once I get to breakthrough, now we're moving toward excitement. No, then pain. Oh, okay. And excitement. Okay, excitement and then excitement. And I think that's part of a healthy life where there's both aspects to your journey. And so that's why I just kind of come back to that basic power of the aim for truth about the areas that are important, and not giving up on that, and finding people who get your journey and aren't upset by your questions and aren't feeling like you shouldn't be having those doubts, because you're not allowed to wonder about that. Like, you need to believe this, otherwise there's so much shame. People shame each other out of like even exploring, and we need space to explore. It's very important that the treasures that people see from their unique explorations, they're useful for other people. Um, it doesn't seem like that maybe at the time. It feels like, oh, this is just my own journey. I'm trying to understand something for myself. But if you can get some understanding, then you have something for others. And that I think is also why there can be experiences that are very unique, where you get something that like nobody else really has that angle. And I feel like in your work, Robert, you're actually in a place on the intellectual landscape thinking about intrinsic probabilities and Paul Draper's work that like nobody else in the whole world is sitting right exactly where you're at. And you're like a little lighthouse at that location, and you're finding out more and more and more. And then you're going to be sharing that with people who will all benefit from that. And so it's special to do that. But there's all sorts of reasons like to give up or to not do that or go do something else. And sometimes we need a break, but just to keep that aim alive, I think is very, very powerful.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I thought, yeah, that was really beautiful. So I really appreciate all that. And it's been really nice talking with you and getting to get more clarity, but also just get to meet and talk about all these things. So yeah, I really appreciate it. And I think that's a great place to end, because that was a great summary of everything that's important about this.
Thank you. And I want to just say, I'm glad we persisted through technological obstacles. There was
Yeah.
sort of every reason to be like, oh, I don't know, maybe we should reschedule. And you're like, nope, let's just keep persisting. So I'm
Yeah.
glad we did.
Yeah. Me too.
Yep.
That's great. Okay. I'll stop recording now.
Okay.